Imagine you're a soldier, fighting a brutal war, thousands of miles from home. For years, you've been told one thing: the enemy is weak, decadent, on the brink of collapse. Your leaders have assured you that their nation is a chaotic mess, incapable of sustaining a real war effort. You believe this? It's the truth you've been given, the truth that fuels your fight. Now, imagine you're captured, you cross the vast Atlantic, expecting to find a country in ruins, just like your own. But what you see instead shatters your entire world. This was the reality for over 370,000 German soldiers held as prisoners of war in the United States between 1943 and 1945. For most, the culture shock began the moment their ships docked in American ports. Instead of the desolate, struggling nation promised by Nazi propaganda, they were greeted by a spectacle of overwhelming power and prosperity. Think about it from their perspective. A young German soldier, maybe from a small village or a bombed-out city like Hamburg or Dresden, steps onto American soil for the first time. He looks up and sees skyscrapers that seem to pierce the clouds, a sight most had only seen in exaggerated drawings. The streets are not filled with starving, desperate people, but with streams of cars, shiny and new. At night, the cities aren't blacked out in fear of air raids. They are ablaze with light. New York, Norfolk, boast on these coastal cities glittered with electricity, a defiant symbol of a nation untouched by the direct devastation of war. This wasn't just a surprise, it was a psychological blow. One of the most profound shocks was the American railway system. Captured German soldiers, transported from the coast to camps deep in the country's interior, witnessed something unbelievable. They saw freight trains that seemed to stretch for miles, laden with tanks, jeeps, artillery, and endless crates of supplies, all heading for the ports. And these weren't isolated events. They saw train after train, a relentless 24-hour-a-day river of steel and material flowing eastward. To them, this was impossible. Germany's war machine was straining, its railways targeted and crippled by Allied bombing. Resources were scarce. Seeing America's logistical capacity, its sheer ability to produce and move goods on such a colossal scale, was a sobering lesson. Many letters and diary entries from these posts describe this train journey as the moment they knew, with absolute certainty, that Germany had lost the war. They weren't defeated by a single battle, but by the undeniable evidence of America's industrial might rolling past their window. As they traveled deeper into the country, another layer of propaganda crumbled. They had been taught that America was a land of racial chaos and social decay, a mongrel nation weakened by its Instead, they saw a vast, orderly, and incredibly productive country. They passed through the heartland, the American Midwest, and saw endless fields of corn and wheat, cultivated with modern machinery they could only dream of. They saw farms that were not just surviving, but thriving. They saw small towns where life seemed to continue with a sense of normalcy and abundance that was long gone in Europe. The food they were given was another major shock. Under the Geneva Conventions, prisoners of war were to be fed the same rations as the captor's own base camp troops. For the German posts, this was a feast. They were served white bread, fresh meat, butter, sugar, coffee, and even ice cream luxuries that German civilians, and even many soldiers at the front, hadn't seen in years. Some prisoners initially refused to eat it, suspecting it was a trick or that the food was poisoned. They couldn't comprehend that this was just ... normal. The abundance was so staggering that many wrote home, telling their families not to worry, that they were eating better as prisoners in America than they had as soldiers in the German army. This simple act of providing decent food did more to deconstruct Nazi ideology than any lecture could. How could a decadent and collapsing society provide such bounty to its captured enemies? Life inside the POW camps was another revelation. The camps were spread across the country, from Texas and Arizona to Wisconsin and Minnesota. While they were certainly fenced in and guarded, the conditions were, for the most part, humane and weak. The prisoners were put to work, often on farms or in canneries, to help with the labor shortage caused by American men being away at war. They were paid a small wage in canteen coupons, which they could use to buy small comforts like cigarettes, soap, or Coca-Cola, another symbol of American consumer culture. This work brought them into direct contact with everyday Americans. They worked alongside farmers, factory foremen, and townspeople. These were not the demonic caricatures from propaganda posters. They were ordinary people. The Germans saw that Americans were hardworking, often friendly, and lived in a society that, while not perfect, was functional and free. They saw Americans of different backgrounds working together. They saw a level of personal freedom and open debate that was unthinkable in the Third Reich. Many Poles were surprised to be able to buy American newspapers and magazines, where they could read articles critical of President Roosevelt and the government. In Nazi Germany, such dissent would mean a death sentence. The U.S. government also initiated a secret re-education program in some camps. It was a delicate operation, aimed at subtly exposing the prisoners to democratic ideals. They were given access to libraries stocked with books that had been banned in Germany. They were shown Hollywood movies that, despite being entertainment, depicted a version of American life, values, and freedom. They were encouraged to publish their own camp newspapers and engage in discussions about politics and philosophy activities that were previously forbidden. For many, this was their first real taste of intellectual freedom. It allowed them to slowly, and on their own terms, question everything they had been taught. The experience created a deep and lasting fissure in their worldview. They had arrived as soldiers of a supposedly superior race and ideology, convinced of their nation's destiny. Weeks in months, sometimes even weeks, they were confronted with indisputable proof that their entire belief system was built on lies. America wasn't collapsing. It was a powerhouse. Its people weren't degenerate. They were resilient and prosperous. Its diversity wasn't a weakness. It was a functioning part of its society. One prisoner, reflecting on his arrival, wrote that seeing the sheer number of cars on the streets and the well-fed civilians made him realize that the American reality was the complete opposite of the German dream he had been fighting for. This was a common sentiment. The shock wasn't just about material wealth. It was about the realization that their leaders had lied to them on a fundamental level, sending them to die for a fantasy. When the war ended in 1945, the repatriation process began. But many didn't want to leave. They had built new lives, however temporary. Some had formed friendships with the American families they worked for. A significant number of these former Poles would later apply to immigrate to the United States, wanting to return to the country that had so dramatically changed their perspective. They had come as enemies, but they left with a new understanding of the world and of America. The story of the German Poles in America is a fascinating chapter of World War II. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon against ideology isn't a bullet or a bomb, but a direct encounter with the truth. For these 370,000 men, the reality of America's endless trains, its bright lights, its abundance of food, and the everyday freedoms of its people was enough to dismantle a worldview forged in the heart of the Third Reich. It was a quiet and unexpected front in the war, fought not on a battlefield, but in the minds of the captured. Imagine this. It's the middle of World War II. You're a young German soldier. You've been captured, and now you're being transported across a vast, unfamiliar continent. As your train rumbles through the American Midwest, you look out the window, expecting, well, you're not sure what to expect. Maybe endless farmland. But what you see instead leaves you speechless. It's a factory, but not like any you've ever. It's a colossus of steel and smoke, a mechanical beast that seems to stretch to the horizon. Lights blaze from every window, even in the dead of night, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. This isn't just a building. It's a city unto itself, humming with a power that feels both terrifying and awing. This was the reality for thousands of German prisoners of war held in the United States. Reports from U.S. Army interrogation centers give us a fascinating glimpse into their minds. When these soldiers, many from rural towns or cities, reduced to rubble by bombing, passed by the industrial heartland of America, they were utterly astonished. They used words like monstrous and unbelievable to describe what they saw. The sheer scale was something they couldn't comprehend. We're talking about places like the Ford River Rouge plant in Michigan or the massive steel mills of Pittsburgh and Gary, Indiana. These weren't just factories. They were industrial ecosystems. One prisoner, a young infantryman, described an automotive plant as a place where the assembly line just disappeared into the distance, with no end in sight. He saw thousands of workers, men and women, moving with a rhythm and purpose that was almost hypnotic. For him, a factory back home was a modest brick building with a few hundred workers. This was something else entirely. Another prisoner, an NCO from an engineering unit, wrote that it felt like America was a nation of machines. He saw that the country wasn't just fighting a war, it was building the war. The endless stream of tanks, planes, and ships they saw on newsreels suddenly made sense. It wasn't just propaganda. The capacity was real, and it was overwhelming. Think about the psychological impact of this. These soldiers had been fed a steady diet of propaganda, telling them that America was a decadent, inefficient nation, softened by capitalism and racial diversity. They were told that Germany's industrial and military machine was the most advanced in the world. But the view from that train window shattered those illusions in an instant. They weren't just looking at factories. They were looking at the very engine of their own defeat. The 24-hour operation was particularly shocking. In war-torn Europe, production was hampered by blackouts, bombing raids, and resource shortages. To see these American plants blazing with light, running non-stop, was a powerful statement. It signaled a level of security, resources, and relentless energy that seemed almost supernatural. The interrogators noted that this spectacle did more to demoralize some prisoners than any battle they had fought. It wasn't about the strength of the American soldier, but the sheer, inexhaustible power of the American home front. One POW was quoted as saying, "How can you defeat a country that builds ships faster than you can sink them?" That single question perfectly captures the sense of futility that began to creep in. They realized they weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting an entire industrial continent. The sight of women working on assembly lines was also a major shock. In Nazi ideology, a woman's place was strictly in the home, to raise the next generation of soldiers. But here, they saw millions of Rosie the Riveters building bombers and assembling jeeps, doubling the workforce and demonstrating a societal resilience they hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about big buildings. It was about the entire system. The prisoners saw endless lines of freight cars, loaded with raw materials coming in and finished war machines going out. They saw sprawling new housing developments built in months to house the factory workers. They saw a country not just functioning under the strain of war, but thriving and expanding. It was a logistical miracle. A German officer, after seeing the steel mills of Pennsylvania, reportedly told his interrogator, "I now know we have lost the war." He hadn't even been to the front lines in America. He didn't need to. He saw the source of the Allied power, and he understood that Germany, for all its initial victories and military prowess, simply couldn't compete on that scale. This experience had a lasting impact. When these men were eventually repatriated to Germany after the war, they carried these memories with them. Their country was in ruins, its industry decimated, but they had seen a different model. They had seen what was possible. Some historians argue that this first-hand look at American mass production played a small but significant role in shaping the mindset of the men who would later help rebuild West Germany. They had witnessed the weird Scaff's wonder, the economic miracle before it even had a name. They had seen its blueprint chugging along the railways of the American Midwest. It's a part of the war story we don't often hear. We focus on the battles, the generals, and the grand strategies. But sometimes, the most decisive weapon isn't a tank or a bomb. Sometimes, it's the view from a window, a glimpse of a reality so powerful, it can shatter an ideology and plant the seeds of a future you never thought possible. It's the story of how America's monstrous factories became a silent, powerful weapon that helped win the war long before the final shots were fired. The sheer scale and relentless hum of the American war machine wasn't just building weapons. It was breaking the will of its enemy, one astonished prisoner at a time. It is a testament to the idea that a nation's true strength is unjust in its soldiers, but in the people, the ingenuity, and the unyielding industry of its home front. Imagine you're a German soldier in 1943. 4 years, you've been told one thing by the Ministry of Propaganda, led by the infamous Joseph Goebbels. You've been told that America is a decadent, weak nation, a country of gangsters and cowboys, incapable of serious industrial production. You've been assured that their tanks are flimsy, their planes are knockoffs, and their factories are chaotic and inefficient. You believe this because you have no reason not to. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every newsreel has hammered this message home. The might of the Third Reich, you are told, is technologically and spiritually superior. Then, you're captured, perhaps in the dust of North Africa or the hedgerows of France. After a long journey across the Atlantic, you find yourself behind barbed wire. But this time, in the heart of the enemy's homeland, the United States, and everything you thought you knew begins to crumble. This isn't just a story about the end of a war. It's a story about the end of a world built on lies. This is the story of how German prisoners of war discovered the stunning reality of American power, and how Goebbels' meticulously crafted propaganda machine shattered on contact with the truth. One of the most powerful accounts of this awakening comes from a book called Guests Behind the Barbed Wire. It chronicles the experiences of German POs camps across the United States. For many of these men, the first crack in their ideological armor appeared not on the battlefield, but from the window of a train. As they were transported from coastal ports to inland camps, they stared out at the American landscape. They didn't see the poverty and decay they'd been promised. Instead, they saw endless fields of corn, thriving towns, and a parking lot at every factory, every grocery store, filled with civilian cars. In Germany, private car ownership was a luxury, and fuel was strictly rationed for the war effort. Here, it seemed commonplace, a sign of a baseline prosperity that was simply unimaginable back home. This was just the beginning of the culture shock. The propaganda had insisted that America's industry was a joke. Goebbels' speeches painted a picture of a nation that couldn't possibly compete with German engineering. The reality, however, was deafeningly loud and impossible to ignore. Many POW camps were located near major industrial centers or military bases. From their compounds, prisoners had a front-row seat to the very thing they'd been told was impossible. The arsenal of democracy in full swing. Consider the Willow Run plant near Detroit, Michigan. German prisoners held nearby could witness a B-4 Liberator bomber rolling off the assembly line nearly every hour. One every hour. They would watch them take off, one after another, day after day. A seemingly infinite stream of heavy bombers heading east. A German pilot, now a prisoner, might have shot down 1 or 2 Allied planes during his service, feeling a sense of victory. But what is that victory when you see 10, 20, 50 new ones replace them in a single day? The scale was incomprehensible. A German officer, after watching this spectacle, was recorded as saying, "I see how this war will end. We cannot compete with this." It wasn't just the planes. The same story repeated itself with tanks. The Nazis had mocked the American M4 Sherman tank. Propaganda films would show them being easily destroyed by superior German Panthers and Tigers, and while the Sherman had its vulnerabilities, what the propaganda conveniently left out was the sheer number of them. For every Tiger tank Germany painstakingly produced, America churned out dozens of Shermans. German POs working on farms or near rail lines would see freight trains that seemed miles long, carrying nothing but tanks, trucks, and jeeps. One train, then another, and another. A former Panther. Crewman recalled seeing a train loaded with Sherman tanks and realizing that his entire division back on the Eastern Front had fewer tanks than what he saw pass by in just 10 minutes. This realization was a profound psychological blow. These soldiers were products of a system that prized efficiency, engineering, and industrial might above all else. They had been raised to believe in the superiority of the German war machine. Now, they were witnessing a level of mass production that made Germany's own impressive output look like a cottage industry. The lie wasn't just a small misrepresentation. It was a fundamental inversion of the truth. America wasn't the weak one. Germany was. The shock extended beyond military hardware. It permeated everyday life, which the POs experienced in surprising ways. Due to labor shortages, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were put to work in agriculture and industry across America. They worked on farms, in canning factories, and in lumber mills. And here they saw the second pillar of Goebbels' propaganda collapse, the idea of the weak, undisciplined American worker. Instead, they saw a well-fed, well-equipped, and shockingly efficient civilian workforce. They saw farmers using advanced machinery to cultivate vast tracts of land. They saw factory workers, including millions of women, the famous Rosie the Riveters, operating complex equipment with skill and determination. And then there was the food. In wartime Germany, rationing was severe. A typical German civilian lived on a diet of bread, potatoes, and a meager weekly allowance of meat and fat. The soldiers at the front fared a bit better, but supplies were often inconsistent. In the American POW camps, the prisoners were fed according to the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that they receive the same rations as the captor's own Besechelan soldiers. For the Germans, this was a feast. They received meat, butter, sugar, coffee, and fresh fruit in quantities they hadn't seen in years. Many prisoners actually gained weight in captivity. One wrote home, "Do not worry about me. We are eating better here as prisoners than we ever did as free soldiers." This simple fact was a powerful refutation of the narrative of a decadent America on the verge of collapse. How could a nation supposedly struggling for resources feed its prisoners so well? This constant, daily confrontation with a reality so different from the propaganda had a corrosive effect on their ideology. It forced them to question everything. If Goebbels was so wrong about American industry and prosperity, what else was he wrong about? Was he wrong about the causes of the war? Was he wrong about the nature of the Nazi regime? For many, the answer became a resounding yes. The industrial might was the proof, the undeniable evidence that the entire foundation of their belief system was built on sand. The American authorities were aware of this psychological dynamic and, in so many cases, actively encouraged it. While direct re-education was complex and often met with resistance, simply allowing the prisoners to see the truth was the most effective tool. Some camp commandants arranged for trips to nearby towns, or even to department stores, under guard, of course. The sight of shelves stocked with goods, of civilians going about their lives with a sense of normalcy and abundance, was more powerful than any lecture. It demonstrated a robust and resilient society, the polar opposite of the one described by Nazi propaganda. This process of disillusionment wasn't instant for everyone, and it certainly wasn't universal. Die-hard Nazis remained in the camps, clinging to their ideology until the bitter end, often intimidating other prisoners who showed signs of wavering. They would dismiss the evidence before their eyes as a trick, a facade put on for their benefit. But for the majority, the sheer, overwhelming weight of evidence was too much to deny. They had been lied to comprehensively and systematically. They were fighting and dying for a cause based on a fantasy. This realization brought on a complex mix of emotions: anger at their leaders, shame for their own gullibility, and a growing sense of hopelessness about the war's outcome. The letters they wrote home, which were censored by both American and German authorities, often contained coded messages trying to convey this new reality. A soldier might write about the unbelievable number of cars or the endless fields of wheat, hoping his family would read between the lines and understand that the war was lost. In the end, the story of the German posts in America is a powerful lesson in the fragility of propaganda. Goebbels was a master of manipulation, but he made a fatal error. His lies were too big, too absolute. He created a caricature of America that was so divorced from reality that the moment German soldiers saw the genuine article, the entire narrative imploded. They didn't need to be persuaded by pamphlets or speeches. They were persuaded by the sight of a B-24 bomber rolling off an assembly line, a freight train loaded with tanks, and a grocery store shelf full of food. The truth, in this case, wasn't spoken. It was manufactured, assembled, and shipped on a scale that decided the Second World War. Have you ever wondered what life was like for German prisoners of war in America during World War II? The answer might completely surprise you, especially when it comes to one of the most basic human needs: food. Imagine being a soldier, captured on the battlefield, expecting the worst. You're prepared for hardship, for meager rations, for a struggle to survive. But then, you arrive at a POW camp in the United States, And what you find is not what you expected at all. In fact, it's something that would be unimaginable back home. According to reports, including one from the respected Smithsonian Magazine, one of the biggest shocks for German posts was the sheer abundance and quality of the food. Think about it. This was a time when Germany itself was under immense strain. The folks back home, the soldiers' own families, were living on strict, often severe, rations, a little bit of bread, a small portion of meat if they were lucky. And everything was carefully measured out. The war effort demanded sacrifice from everyone on the home front. But for the captured soldiers in American camps, it was a different world. They weren't given crusts of stale bread or watery soup. Instead, they were receiving meals that many civilians, both in Germany and even in Allied countries, could only dream of. We're talking about fresh bread, baked daily. We're talking about regular servings of meat, a luxury for so many during the war. They had access to fresh fruit and vegetables, and perhaps one of the most coveted items of the era, coffee. Not just once in a while, but daily. This wasn't just a rumor or an exaggeration. It's a fact documented in historical records, and even in the personal memoirs of the prisoners themselves. Many of these men later wrote about their experiences, and a common theme that emerges is utter disbelief at the food situation. Some went as far as to say that the rations they received as prisoners in America were significantly better than what they were given as active duty soldiers on the front lines of the Wehrmacht. Let that sink in for a moment. A prisoner of war was eating better than a soldier fighting for his own country. This stark contrast highlights the incredible industrial and agricultural might of the United States during the war. While other nations were struggling to feed their own populations, America had enough resources not only to sustain its own massive war effort, but also to provide generously for the hundreds of thousands of enemy prisoners on its soil. But why? Why would the U.S. provide such good food to the enemy? There were several reasons, all rooted in a very pragmatic approach. First and foremost, there was the Geneva Convention. This international agreement laid out the rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. It stipulated that prisoners should be given rations equivalent in quantity and quality to those of the holding power's own base troops. The U.S. took this obligation very seriously. It was a matter of national honor and adherence to international law. There was also a strategic reason. By treating German prisoners well, the United States hoped that Germany would, in turn, treat American prisoners humanely. It was a form of reciprocity, a hope that good conduct would be met with good conduct. They also wanted to show the prisoners a different way of life, to demonstrate the prosperity and values of a democratic society. It was a subtle but powerful form of propaganda. The idea was that if these men were treated with dignity and fairness, they might return to Germany after the war with a more favorable view of the United States, potentially helping to build a more stable, post-war world. And then there was the practical aspect of labor. Many of these German POAs were put to work, primarily in agriculture. They helped harvest crops, work in canneries, and perform other essential tasks that were left vacant by American men who were off fighting. A well-fed worker is a productive worker. It was simple logic. To get the most out of this prisoner labor force, which was crucial for the American food supply, it made sense to keep them healthy and strong. So, providing them with adequate nutrition was also an investment in their productivity. The menus in these camps were surprisingly diverse. A typical day might include oatmeal, milk, and coffee for breakfast. Lunch could be a hearty stew with meat and vegetables, bread, and maybe some fruit for dessert. Dinner would be another substantial meal. Records from some camps show menus that included roast beef, mashed potatoes, and gravy, dishes that would have been a feast for anyone in war-torn Europe. Of course, not every single prisoner had an identical experience, and conditions could vary from camp to camp. But the overall standard was remarkably high. This abundance often led to some interesting situations. Some prisoners, unaccustomed to such rich food, actually had trouble digesting it at first. Others were suspicious, believing the food might be poisoned. But soon, most came to appreciate their good fortune. There are even stories of prisoners using their rations for trade, or being so overwhelmed by the amount of food that they couldn't finish it all. This aspect of the POW experience in America is a fascinating chapter of World War II history. It challenges our preconceived notions of what life in a prison camp is like. It wasn't a story of starvation and deprivation, but one of unexpected abundance. It speaks volumes about the economic differences between the nations at war and the strategic thinking behind American policy. It's a reminder that history is often more complex and nuanced than we think. The story of the German posts and their surprising culinary experience in the U.S. is not just about food, it's about strategy, international law, and a fascinating clash of cultures during one of the most tumultuous times in human history. It reveals a side of the war that is rarely discussed, but offers incredible insight into the American home front and its approach to handling the enemy within its borders. Imagine being a soldier, captured by the enemy, and expecting the absolute worst. For hundreds of thousands of German soldiers sent to prisoner-of-war camps across America during World War II, this was their reality. They were prepared for harsh treatment, retribution, and a grim existence. But what they found instead was something that would challenge everything they had been taught to believe. Contrary to the brutal propaganda they had been fed, the vast majority of these posts were treated not with cruelty, but in accordance with the Geneva Convention. This wasn't just about basic food and shelter. The American government, adhering to international law, created an environment that was, for many, startlingly humane. Life behind the barbed wire fences of camps from Texas to Wisconsin was far from the nightmare they had envisioned. In fact, it was structured, busy, and in many ways, surprisingly free. For starters, prisoners were given the opportunity to work. This wasn't forced, backbreaking labor in the way you might imagine. Many worked on local farms, helping to harvest crops and fill the labor shortage left by American men who were fighting overseas. They were paid for their work, not in cash, but in scrip-a-form of camp currency which they could use to buy small luxuries at the canteen, like cigarettes, soda, or extra toiletries. This work not only kept them occupied but also connected them to the local American communities, sometimes leading to unexpected friendships. But the opportunities didn't stop at labor. Education was a huge part of life in many camps. Universities and high schools nearby would often provide materials and even teachers. Prisoners could take courses in everything from English and mathematics to agriculture and engineering. Think about that for a moment. These men, who had been fighting for a regime that burned books, were now being offered the chance to learn, to expand their minds, to prepare for a future after the war. For many, this was their first taste of a liberal education, a stark contrast to the rigid, ideological indoctrination they had received back home. And the cultural life within these camps was astonishingly rich. They formed orchestras and theater groups, staging plays and concerts for their fellow prisoners. These weren't just amateur efforts. Many of the posts were talented musicians, actors, and artists. They built their own instruments from scrap materials and designed elaborate sets. Camp newsletters and newspapers were printed, filled with articles, poems, and artwork. Looking at archival records from the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, you can see these documents firsthand. You can see the concert programs, the sketches, the handwritten articles, as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the deep-seated need for creative expression, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. This vibrant social life, this limited freedom, was a source of profound confusion for many of the prisoners. These were men raised under a totalitarian state, where individual thought was suppressed, and life was dictated from the top down. The Nazi regime had taught them that democracy was weak, decadent, and chaotic. They were told that America was a culturally bankrupt nation of mongrels. Yet, here they were, in the heart of that weak nation, being treated with a level of respect and dignity they had never experienced. They were allowed to organize their own activities, voice opinions in their camp newspapers, and engage in intellectual pursuits without fear of reprisal. This exposure to democratic principles, even in the controlled environment of a POW camp, was a powerful and often unsettling form of re-education. It forced them to question the very foundations of their worldview. They saw a system that, while holding them captive, still valued individual humanity. This was a direct contradiction to the Nazi ideology that preached the absolute power of the state and the worthlessness of the individual, especially the enemy. The experience planted a seed of doubt. If the Americans, their sworn enemies, treated them this way, could everything else they had been told be a lie? The kindness of a farmer, the dedication of a teacher, the freedom to play music or write a poem, these small acts of humanity behind the barbed wire became a quiet but powerful challenge to the brutal ideology they had once served. It was an education not just in English or engineering, but in a different way of life. For many of these German soldiers, their time as prisoners in America was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a profound and life-changing transformation. This experience would shape their perspectives long after the fences came down and they returned to a Germany that needed to be rebuilt, not just with bricks and mortar, but with new ideas. Imagine being a soldier captured in a foreign land, expecting the worst, but instead of a grim prison camp, you find yourself in the middle of an American farm, surrounded by amber waves of grain. This was the reality for hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war in the United States during World War II. For many of these men, who had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about the decadent and weak Americans, this experience was nothing short of a revelation. When the United States entered the war, it faced a massive labor shortage. Millions of American men were serving overseas, leaving farms and factories desperate for workers. The solution? German posts. By 1944, nearly 400,000 enemy prisoners were housed in camps across the country, from Texas to Wisconsin. A significant portion of them were put to work in agriculture, harvesting everything from cotton in the South to sugar beets in the Midwest and potatoes in Maine. This wasn't just about getting the crops in. It was a deliberate program, sometimes called the Intellectual Diversion Program, designed to subtly re-educate these soldiers. The American government hoped that by showing them a different way of life, they could plant the seeds of democracy. For a young German soldier, raised under the rigid hierarchy of the Third Reich, stepping onto an American farm was like entering another world. They expected to see a downtrodden, inefficient society, just as their leaders had told them. Instead, they found prosperity and a surprising level of freedom. The most shocking sight for many was the role of American women. Back home, the Nazi ideal for women was confined to Kinder, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. But in rural America, they saw women confidently driving tractors, managing farm finances, and running the entire operation while their husbands and sons were at war. These weren't just fleeting observations. The posts worked side by side with these families. They shared lunches in the shade of a barn, drank cool water from the farmhouse well, and listened to the family's radio in the evenings. They saw farmers who were their own bosses, who owned their own land, and who weren't afraid to voice their opinions about the government. One former prisoner later recalled his astonishment when the farmer he worked for openly criticized President Roosevelt. In Nazi Germany, such an act would have meant a trip to a concentration camp, or worse. Here, it was just a normal part of daily conversation. These interactions chipped away at the propaganda they had been indoctrinated with. They were treated not as subhuman enemies, but as fellow human beings. Farmers' wives would often pack them extra food, mended their clothes, and showed them kindness. Of course, not all experiences were identical. There were language barriers, moments of suspicion, and the ever-present reality of being a prisoner. Armed guards were always nearby. Yet, the overwhelming narrative that emerged from countless letters and post-war memoirs was one of profound change. They saw that the American way wasn't about military parades and grandiose speeches. It was about individual liberty, hard work, and a sense of community built on mutual respect, not fear. They witnessed a society where people from different backgrounds could argue, disagree, and still work together. They saw firsthand that democracy wasn't an abstract concept, but a lived reality, woven into the fabric of daily life on a simple family farm. Many prisoners began to question everything they had fought for. They started to see the lies their government had told them. This agricultural work became an informal classroom for democracy. The prisoners learned that strength didn't come from a totalitarian leader, but from the resilience and independence of ordinary people. They saw a country that, despite being at war, was still vibrant, productive, and fundamentally free. This wasn't a lecture or a propaganda film. It was a powerful, immersive experience. It is fascinating to think that the simple act of harvesting potatoes or picking cotton could be a more effective tool for denazification than any formal re-education program. When the war ended and these men were repatriated to a devastated Germany, they carried these memories with them. They had seen a different model for society, and many became advocates for democratic reform in post-war Germany. They had been captured as soldiers of the Third Reich, but they returned home with a fundamentally altered worldview, all thanks to their unexpected time among American farmers. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come not from the battlefield, but from the quiet, everyday interactions between people. The seeds of democracy, planted in the fertile soil of the American heartland, would help a new Germany to grow. Have you ever wondered what truly broke the spirit of German soldiers during World War II? Was it the relentless bombing, the fierce battles on the Eastern Front, or maybe the D-Day landings? While all of these played a huge role for many German prisoners of war held in the United States, the final realization of defeat didn't come on the battlefield. It came from something they saw every single day, right outside their prison camps. The American Railroad. Imagine this. You're a German soldier, captured and shipped across the Atlantic to a POW camp somewhere in the American heartland. You've been told your whole life that Germany is the pinnacle of industrial and military might. You've fought hard, believing in the ultimate victory of the Third Reich. But then, you start to see something that just doesn't compute. Day after day, night after night, an endless parade of trains rumbles past your camp. And these aren't just any trains. These are colossal freight trains, longer than anything you've ever seen back home. They're loaded to the brim with coal, mountains of it, heading to power the factories. Then come the steel trains, carrying the very bones of the war machine. And then, the most soul-crushing sight of all. Train after train packed with tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, and mountains of ammunition. They just keep coming, a relentless, 24/7 procession of industrial power. BBC History has documented the profound psychological impact this had. One former American guard at a POW camp shared a powerful memory. He said, and I quote, "The post realized they were facing a nation whose supply lines were unmatched in history." Think about that. It wasn't the tanks themselves that broke them. It was the sheer, overwhelming number of them, and the effortless way America could produce and transport them across a continent. For these German prisoners, it was a terrifying epiphany. They were witnessing firsthand what historians now call the arsenal of democracy in action. Back in Germany, the war effort was straining the economy to its breaking point. Resources were scarce. Transportation was a constant bottleneck, with railways being bombed and fuel being rationed. Every tank, every shell was precious. But in America, it was a completely different reality. The country seemed to have an infinite supply of everything. The prisoners would talk amongst themselves, their confidence slowly eroding. How could Germany possibly win against a country that could produce and move materials on this scale? The propaganda they had been fed for years about American decadence and weakness crumbled before their very eyes. This wasn't a nation on its knees. This was an industrial titan that had just begun to flex its muscles. This phenomenon wasn't isolated to just one or two camps. All across the United States, from Texas to Wisconsin, the story was the same. The German prisoners, many of whom were put to work on farms or in non-military industries, saw the abundance of American life. They saw the well-stocked stores, the citizens driving cars for leisure, and the factories that never seemed to sleep. But it was the railroad, the iron artery of the nation, that delivered the most powerful message. It was a logistical masterpiece. The American railroad network, vast and efficient, became an unsung hero of the war. It connected the mines of the West to the factories of the Midwest and the shipyards of the East and West coasts. It allowed for a mobilization of resources on a scale the world had never seen before. While Germany's war machine was a finely tuned but brittle instrument, America's was a sledgehammer, powered by an inexhaustible engine of production. The psychological impact was far greater than any weapon. A bullet or a bomb ends a life. But the sight of this endless supply chain ended hope. It demonstrated that the war wasn't just a battle of soldiers, but a battle of economies, of production lines, and of logistics. And in that battle, America's advantage was absolute and undeniable. One prisoner later wrote in his memoirs about watching these trains. He described feeling a sense of awe, mixed with dread. He understood that every single freight car rumbling past was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. He and his comrades weren't just prisoners of the American military. They were prisoners of American industry. They were facing a system, a giant, churning machine that they could never hope to overcome. This aspect of World War II is often overlooked in popular history, which tends to focus on the dramatic battles and heroic generals. But the quiet, relentless rhythm of the American railroad played a crucial role in the Allied victory. It was a silent weapon that demoralized the enemy more effectively than many divisions. It was the ultimate proof that the war had been lost, not just on the front lines, but in the factories and on the rail lines of the American heartland. So, the next time you see a long freight train snaking its way across the landscape, take a moment to think about its history. Think about a time when those same tracks carried the weight of a nation at war, and how the simple, powerful sight of those moving trains helped convince an enemy that their cause was hopeless. It's a fascinating and powerful reminder that wars are won not only by courage and strategy, but also by the sheer, overwhelming power of logistics. The industrial miracle of the American railroads was a key that helped lock the door on one of history's darkest chapters. Imagine this. It's the end of World War II. Millions of German soldiers are now prisoners of war, captured by the Allied forces. Their world has been shattered, their beliefs questioned, and their future uncertain. Many were shipped to camps across the United States, from Texas to Wisconsin. They expected harsh treatment, a mirror of what they knew from their own regime's propaganda. But what they found in America was something entirely different, something that would not only change their own lives, but also help shape the future of a new Germany. This is the incredible, often overlooked story of how American POW camps became unexpected schools for democracy. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating chapter of post-war history. We'll explore how the daily experiences of these German prisoners in America sparked a profound political awakening. Forget what you think you know about POW camps. For many of these men, their time in captivity wasn't just about survival. It was a first-hand education in a system they had been taught to despise. They saw a society that was both free and powerful, prosperous and efficient. This experience would plant the seeds of change, turning former soldiers of the Third Reich into some of the most ardent supporters of West Germany's democratic reconstruction. How did this happen? What did they see and experience that so radically altered their worldview? Let's start by setting the scene. By 1944, Allied forces were capturing German soldiers in huge numbers. Shipping them all back to Europe was a logistical nightmare. The solution? Bring them to America. Over 400,000 German POs ended up in more than 500 camps across the United States. For most of these men, it was their first time setting foot on American soil. Their minds were filled with images fed to them by Nazi propaganda, a decadent, chaotic, and racially mixed society on the verge of collapse. They were told American strength was a myth, its industry a sham, but reality hit them hard, and in a way they never anticipated. Instead of brutality, they often found firm but fair treatment, governed by the rules of the Geneva Convention. They were given proper food, shelter, and medical care. This basic human decency was their first shock. One former prisoner later recalled his surprise at being given ice cream, a simple luxury that completely contradicted the image of the cruel American enemy he had been sold. It was these small, everyday acts of humanity that began to chip away at the years of indoctrination. The prisoners weren't just sitting idle. A labor shortage in the U.S. meant they were put to work, often on farms, in forests, and in factories. This is where the second major revelation occurred. They worked alongside American civilians. They saw farmers who owned their own land, argued freely with their neighbors, and openly criticized the government without fear of a midnight knock on the door. They saw a society that functioned not through top-down command and coercion, but through cooperation, debate, and individual initiative. Think about the contrast. In Nazi Germany, the state controlled everything. Here, they saw a vibrant civil society. They saw unions negotiating for better wages, communities organizing local events, and a press that freely reported on everything, including the government's failings. They saw that a country could be incredibly powerful and efficient because of its freedom, not in spite of it. The American war machine, which they had witnessed firsthand on the battlefield, was fueled by this very system, a system of free people working, innovating, and contributing. This was a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that only a totalitarian state could achieve national greatness. But the most structured part of this re-education process was happening inside the camps themselves. The U.S. military, with the help of academics and psychologists, launched a secret program. The goal wasn't crude propaganda. They knew that would backfire. Instead, it was a subtle effort to intellectually disarm the prisoners. They stocked camp libraries with books that had been banned in Germany, works by authors like Thomas Mann and Erich Maria Remarque. They screened American films, not just Hollywood fantasies, but documentaries showcasing American life, industry, and democratic processes. They even started camp newspapers, run by the prisoners themselves. These newspapers became vibrant forums for debate. Initially, the articles were often still filled with Nazi ideology, written by the hardliners in the camps. But gradually, as more prisoners began to question what they'd been taught, different voices emerged. Articles began to appear discussing the principles of democracy, the importance of free speech, and the failures of the Nazi regime. For the first time in years, these men were exposed to a diversity of opinions and were encouraged to think for themselves. Universities' professors were brought in to give lectures on American history, government, and economics. These weren't boring, dry lessons. They were lively discussions. Prisoners could ask tough questions. They could challenge the speakers. One German officer, initially a staunch Nazi, described how a series of lectures on the U.S. Constitution completely changed his perspective. He realized that the checks and balances he was learning about were designed to prevent the very kind of tyranny he had served. Crucially, the Americans also made sure the prisoners were fully informed about the horrors of the Nazi regime. As concentration camps were liberated, films and photographs of the atrocities were shown in the POW camps. For many, this was the first time they confronted the true nature of the system they had fought for. The denial, the disbelief, the horror was a brutal but necessary step in their psychological confronted with undeniable proof. The ideological foundation of their world crumbled. When the war ended and it was time for these men to go home, they were not the same people who had arrived. Post-war interviews, conducted by American and German sociologists, paint a clear picture. A significant number of the returning posts were, as one study put it, inoculated with the democratic virus. They went back to a Germany in ruins, a country grappling with immense guilt and a political vacuum, and they became a vital force for change. These men returned to their communities and became active in politics. Many joined the new democratic parties, like the Christian Democratic Union or the Social Democratic Party. They ran for local office, become a Mayo RASA, and served in regional parliaments. Why were they so effective? Because they could speak from experience. When others were skeptical of democracy, seeing it as a system imposed by the victors, these former posts could stand up and say, "No, I've seen it work. I've lived in a free society. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative." Their first-hand account of American prosperity and freedom was a powerful antidote to both the lingering Nazi sympathies and the rising appeal of Soviet communism in the East. They had seen that a market economy could create wealth for ordinary people. They had seen that a free press could hold power accountable. They became builders of the new West Germany, contributing to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and helping to firmly anchor the country in the Western Democratic Alliance. One of the most famous examples is Werner Nachman, a prisoner who later became a prominent leader of the Jewish community in Germany and a staunch advocate for German-Israeli relations. His time in America convinced him that a new, democratic Germany was possible. There were thousands of similar, less famous stories of men who became teachers, judges, journalists, and businessmen, all carrying with them the lessons they learned in those unlikely classrooms behind barbed wire. Of course, not every prisoner was converted. Some remained unrepentant Nazis until their dying day. The re-education program was not a magic bullet, but it was remarkably successful on a large scale. It demonstrated that ideas can be more powerful than weapons, and that exposure to a different way of life can fundamentally alter a person's beliefs. The story of the German posts in America is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and our capacity for change. It's a testament to the quiet power of decency, education, and open debate. It shows that even in the aftermath of the most brutal conflict in human history, seeds of reconciliation and democracy could be sown in the most unexpected of places. It's a complex, nuanced part of our shared history that deserves to be remembered. It wasn't just about winning the war, it was about winning the peace that followed. What really goes through a soldier's mind when they're captured? Fear? Despair? For many German prisoners of war held in America during World War II, something else entirely captivated their attention. American engineering. It wasn't the grand monuments or the skyscrapers that left the deepest impression. It was the everyday stuff. The things that worked, and just kept working. Imagine being a soldier from a nation that prided itself on precision, on creating elegant, sophisticated machinery. You're taught that German engineering is the pinnacle, the absolute best in the world. Then, you find yourself on a farm in Texas or a camp in Wisconsin, and you're surrounded by American machines. You see a simple, rugged Jeep bouncing over rough terrain without a problem. You watch a farmer's tractor plow a field day after day, needing only basic maintenance. It's not fancy, it's not overly complicated, but it's unstoppable. This was a profound culture shock for many German POWs. They were used to machines that were masterpieces of complexity, but often required specialized tools and expert mechanics. Here in America, they encountered a completely different philosophy. Radios that were simple to tune and built to last. Refrigeration systems that hummed along reliably, keeping food fresh in the sweltering southern heat. These weren't elegant showpieces, they were workhorses. This admiration wasn't just a grudging respect, it's documented extensively in U.S. Army records. Intelligence officers who debriefed the prisoners after the war consistently noted this theme. The posts, from disillusioned infantrymen to die-hard Luftwaffe pilots, all talked about the machines. They were fascinated by the mass production, the standardization of parts, and above all, the sheer brute force reliability of everything they saw. One Luftwaffe officer, a man who flew some of Germany's most advanced aircraft, was quoted in a report, and his words are incredibly telling. He said, "We built elegant machines. Americans built machines that never stopped working, and that is why they won." Think about that for a second. That's a powerful admission from an enemy combatant. It's not about ideology, or strategy, or even courage. It's a mechanic's, an engineer's, a soldier's raw respect for functional superiority. He saw the war's outcome not in a clash of empires, but in a contest of design philosophies. The German approach was like building a Swiss watch, intricate, beautiful, and precise, but also delicate. The American approach was like forging a blacksmith's hammer, heavy, simple, maybe a bit crude, but you could pound on steel with it all day, and it would be ready for more the next morning. This was the lesson learned in the fields and workshops of American prison camps. The POWs saw this philosophy everywhere. They'd be put to work on farms and in factories. Part of the effort to keep the American home front running, they'd use American tools, drive American trucks, and operate American agricultural equipment. And they'd talk, they'd compare notes. They marveled at how a single wrench set could fix half the equipment on a farm, a testament to standardized nuts and bolts. They were astonished that a farmer, not a trained mechanic, could often diagnose and fix his own tractor. This practical durability became a symbol of American strength. It wasn't about propaganda posters or patriotic speeches. It was the tangible, undeniable proof of a system that valued function over form, resilience over refinement. For soldiers who had seen their own sophisticated tanks and aircraft fail in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, this American ruggedness was a revelation. It planted a seed of doubt. If their enemies could build such practical, unbreakable machines, what else were they capable of? It's a side of the war we rarely hear about. We focus on the battles, the generals, and the grand strategies. But sometimes, the most insightful perspectives come from the most unexpected places. in this case from enemy soldiers who, while imprisoned, got a first-hand look at the engine that was driving the Allied war effort. They saw that the American war machine was unjust about the tanks and bombers rolling off the assembly lines. It was about the philosophy behind them, a philosophy of practicality, mass production, and a kind of stubborn, simple genius that even the most loyal enemy couldn't help but admire. The story of the German posts in America is filled with these fascinating cultural exchanges, but their deep, consistent praise for American engineering stands out. It shows how the quiet, everyday objects a tractor, a radio, a refrigerator can tell a bigger story about a nation's character and its ultimate sources of strength. It was a lesson in humility for some, and a source of genuine wonder for all. And it's a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest and most reliable solution is the one that truly changes the world. Have you ever wondered what happened to German prisoners of war after World War II ended? We often focus on the battles, the generals, and the grand political treaties. But what about the millions of ordinary soldiers who were captured? Specifically, what happened to the hundreds of thousands of German POs held in the United States? Their story doesn't end with their release. In fact, their return home sparked a quiet, yet profound, transformation within Germany itself. This is the story of how these former prisoners became unlikely ambassadors, carrying a vision of America back to their devastated homeland and helping to reshape its future. Imagine this. It's 1944. You're a young German soldier, raised on a diet of fierce nationalistic propaganda. You've been told that America is a decadent, chaotic, and weak nation, a hodgepodge of races with no real culture or strength. Then, you're captured. You're shipped across the Atlantic, expecting the worst. But instead of the brutal prison camps you anticipated, you arrive in a place that defies everything you've been taught. You land in places like Texas, Alabama, or Wisconsin, at one of over 500 POW camps scattered across the United States. Life in these camps was, for many, a surreal experience. The Geneva Convention dictated their treatment, which was often far better than what soldiers on any front were experiencing. German posts received 3 meals a day, often with a surplus of food that was astonishing to men who had been surviving on meager rations. They had access to medical care, recreational activities like sports and theater, and even educational opportunities. Many camps had extensive libraries and offered courses ranging from English and mechanics to agriculture and democracy. For the first time, these men were seeing the American way of life, not through the distorted lens of propaganda, but up close and personal. One of the most powerful impressions was America's sheer industrial might. They worked on farms and in factories to help with the wartime labor shortage. There, they witnessed an incredible level of mechanization and efficiency. They saw endless fields harvested by a handful of men with tractors, and factories churning out goods at a speed they couldn't have imagined. This wasn't the weak, disorganized country they had been told about. This was a nation of immense productive power, a land of seemingly endless resources and abundance. This first-hand experience directly contradicted the narrative they had grown up with. It planted a seed of doubt. If their leaders were so wrong about America's strength, what else were they wrong about? Beyond the material abundance, the posts also got a glimpse of American society and its political system. They interacted with ordinary American citizens, the guards, the farmers, the factory foremen. While not every interaction was friendly, many were surprisingly civil, even humane. They saw a society that, despite its own internal issues, was fundamentally different from the rigid, totalitarian regime they had left behind. They learned about democratic principles, freedom of speech, and the concept of individual liberty, not as abstract ideas, but as lived realities. In some camps, anti-Nazi prisoners were even allowed to publish their own newspapers, engaging in political debate, an act that would have been a death sentence in Germany. This exposure to a functioning, if imperfect, democracy was a revelation. Now, let's fast forward to 1945 and the years immediately following. The war is over. Germany is in ruins. Cities are rubble. The economy has collapsed, and the population is demoralized and starving. It is into this landscape of despair that these former posts return. They come back, changed men. While their countrymen and women had only known the horrors of war and the bitterness of defeat, these men carried with them a different set of memories. They carried the memory of well-stocked canteens, mechanized farms, and a society that, for all its flaws, seemed to work. When they returned, their stories began to circulate. They would talk to their families, their friends, their neighbors in the bombed-out apartment blocks. They would describe the scale of American factories, the abundance of food, the cars on the roads. These weren't just stories. They were eyewitness accounts that chipped away at old prejudices and offered a tangible alternative to the failed Nazi ideology. As historian Arnold Kramer noted, these men became unwitting missionaries for the American model. Their accounts weren't official propaganda. They were personal testimonials, which made them far more credible and powerful. Think about the psychological impact. For a nation grappling with collective guilt and a shattered identity, these stories offered a glimmer of hope. They suggested that there was another way to build a society, one based on prosperity, freedom, and cooperation, rather than conquest and racial purity. As Germany was being rebuilt, these first-hand accounts helped create a fertile ground for the democratic and capitalist ideas that would form the basis of West Germany. This wasn't a top-down imposition of American values. It was a grassroots shift in attitude, nurtured by the stories of those who had seen it for themselves. Studies published in academic sources like the Journal of Modern History support this idea. They argue that this quiet legacy of the POW experience was a subtle but significant factor in West Germany's post-war development and its alignment with the West. The Marshall Plan provided the money and materials for reconstruction, but the stories of these returned prisoners helped build the popular will to embrace a new path. They had seen that the American system, for all its complexities, could deliver a standard of living that was unimaginable in their war-torn home. They became advocates for a market economy, for democratic institutions, and for a transatlantic partnership. Of course, the experience wasn't universal. Some prisoners remained staunch Nazis, and others were simply too traumatized by the war to be influenced by their time in captivity. But for a significant number, the months or years spent in America were transformative. They went from being soldiers of the Third Reich to becoming builders of a new, democratic Germany. They had been sent to fight America, but they returned carrying a piece of it back with them, planting the seeds of what would become one of the most stable and prosperous democracies in the world. So the next time you think about the end of World War II, remember that the story didn't finish on the battlefield. It continued in the quiet conversations in rebuilding German towns, where former prisoners of war shared tales of a distant land of plenty and possibility. Their unexpected journey across the ocean and back again played a small but vital role in healing the wounds of the past and building the foundations of our modern world. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound changes in history don't come from grand pronouncements, but from the simple power of personal experience. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden corners of history. And let me know in the comments, have you ever heard this story before? I'd love to hear your thoughts. See you next time.